Good morning. I want to continue our study and thought for the week on plumb lines for marriage and family. We've had a number of them, and I am really hopeful that this one lands with you as we add to this list of plumb lines, things that keep our family relationships vertical, that keep them on point, as it were. Here's the plumb line. Assume the best. Assume the best in one another. And I'm going to add an additional piece. So the first part is assume the best. And the second is, with that in mind, say yes as often as possible. Let me tell you a story. The other day, I picked up my daughter from a friend's house, my youngest daughter, 16 years old, teenager. She has a permit. She's learning to drive, and she loves to drive whenever the opportunity presents itself. And so she'll often ask me. I picked her up, and I was kind of in a bit of a hurry, and I just wanted to get back to our house. I picked her up, and she started to walk toward the driver's side door and said, "Can I drive?" And I said, "No, not today. I'm just gonna zip us home." She said, "Well, why can't I drive? I really want to drive." And I said, "Look, I just want to get back, please." So she hopped in, a little dejected, into the passenger's seat. And I got going down the road, and I thought to myself, why did I do that? Why did I say no? Like, it literally would make the difference maybe of 30 seconds, her driving as opposed to me driving across our neighborhood to my house from her friend's house. And so I pulled the car over, and I said, "Come on, why don't you get over here and drive?" And she said, "Well, that's okay. That's fine." I said, "No." I said, "Why don't you drive?" And I just told her, I said, I don't even know why I said no. Like, I should have just said yes. I should have just given you the opportunity. I made a mistake, and I realized it and corrected it pretty quickly. I wish there were times when I would correct that quicker, to be honest. Say yes. There are times to say no. If something is destructive, if there's a habit that's being formed that is going to be, and it's going to lead to destruction, well, of course, then you say no. You don't say yes to danger. You don't say yes to foolishness. But if it isn't foolish, if it isn't a malforming of a habit that is going to lead to something down the line, or that is taking them away from something that they ought to be doing, thinking particularly of you as a parent with your kids, then just default to saying yes. And by the way, when you say yes, remember that Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount tells us, let your yes be yes and your no be no. When you say yes, follow through and let it actually be a yes. Like, meaning just maintain it in that posture for an extended perpetuity. It's important that you follow through and that your word in that way is your bond. This is something significant, not something small. So say yes as much as you can. Now notice I started this off with a couple of things, and I said, first, assume the best. See, a precursor to saying yes is just having a general posture in relationships that assumes the best, that assumes the best. And I think this is quite important because we are in relationships, especially in marriage, really can be given to suspicion. We know the other's habits. We know sometimes the way that they say something. We can impute the motive as to why they said something. We can do this with parents. We can see patterns of behavior maybe in our adult parents. Or we assume that they're saying it because of this. Or we assume they're trying to control this or that. Or we assume that they're speaking here because something is bothering them, either related to this or someplace, some way over here. We can do it with our kids as well. We do it with in-law relationships. We certainly do it in sibling relationships. We need to be people who can assume the best. Now, here's a foundation verse. 1 Corinthians 13:7. Love bears all things, and then the most understated thing, in my opinion, from a lot of years of marital counseling with couples, please hear this, please, is this next phrase. Love bears all things, believes all things. Believes all things. Hopes all things. endures all things. Could you imagine a marriage, a family life where you put up with everything? Like, yes, there are things you should speak to about sin and so forth. But I'm saying, and the principle here is that love is conditioned as a default to not lash out, but to bear. But could you imagine a home that believed all things, that assumed the best, that assumed that somebody wasn't trying to be critical, that assumed that someone was trying to be a helper, not a critic, that assumed that someone might be saying it with that tone because they themselves have been compromised in some way throughout the day, that assumed that they weren't trying to be malicious, that assumed they weren't trying to be disrespectful, that you assumed particular things that were healthy and gracious and benevolent about another's motive, that was willing to follow Proverbs 19:11 and to know that it's the glory of a man to look over a matter, to look past it, to overlook it, to not get consumed in it and get sort of bogged down in it. Spurgeon writes some great things about suspicion and how it sort of overtakes us in different ways. How we ought to be careful when it comes to suspicion. How we need to be the kind of people who don't yield again and again to suspicious lives. He says this: it would be better to be deceived 100 times than to live a life of suspicion. Better to be deceived 100 times than to live a life of suspicion. See, suspicion comes when I'm in that spot where I am prone to think the worst of you. If you're prone to think the worst of your husband, if you're prone to think the worst of your child, if you're prone to think the worst of your mother, your father, your in-laws, your wife, your grandchildren, you assume that they are negligent, you assume that they are hostile, you assume that they are critical, you assume they are disrespectful, you assume that they're angry, you assume. Stop. Put it to death. A plumb line of healthy family life is that you believe all things. You assume the best. And, as we started, out of that you say yes as much as you can. Give opportunity and space. Create, and here's what that does. When you put these two, I make them one. Why? Because there's a sense in which assuming the best and saying yes as much as you can, those two together just create, they create such a sweet optimism of family life, a sweet joy of family life, a family where there's freedom rather than law. Have a family where freedom reigns, where freedom reigns. Suspicion, no negativity, that doesn't have place. Let freedom, good, yes, be the undercarriage, so to speak, in the relationships. May the Lord bless you, and may He give your families a sweet positivity about them. Take care. Thanks for watching today's video. If you enjoyed it, click like, subscribe to our channel, or leave us a comment. We'd love to hear from you. Most importantly, if it ministered to you or you know someone it could minister to, share it with them and spread the word about these thoughts for the week. Thanks for joining us.